asked yesterday, what is today's talk going to be about? I said, it's going to be about memory, because that's a lot of these groups think about, but we'll see how that goes. This is a map we've seen before of nationalities all through Europe. It's incredibly complicated. This is before 1914, before the population transfers, and we'll see it in a minute. But I want to review some of the things we said last time. One is this terrible Holodomor in Ukraine, this famine aggravated by activities of the central government that a lot of Ukrainians feel was an attempted genocide by the central government. Historians on the outside say it wasn't a active genocide because it wasn't directed against Ukrainians. It was really taking advantage of the rural population in favor of the urban population, and it spread to other areas like Kazakhstan. But then in Russia, we talked about the Great Purge of 1937 and 38. Of maybe 1 million people were purged, many of them killed. And I should point out that a lot of the people who profited from that were Ukrainians. They moved up in the hierarchy when their superiors were shot or imprisoned. A great example is Khrushchev himself. 1939, the Nazis and the Russians made a pact that divided up Poland. And then in 39, Nazi invasion of Eastern Europe, and then invasion of the Soviet Union in 41. And we talked about the Einsatzgruppen, these special battalions that were essentially roving murderers who killed many more people than the later concentration camps in very early years of the war. And I mentioned a novel that I didn't remember the name of, Jonathan Littell, The Kindly Ones. If you are in the mood for a 900-page doorstopper, I recommend it very much about this period. The Ukrainians had an independence movement and were involved in a war against Polish forces starting in 1943, long before the Nazis were defeated. We also talked about martyrology. You know, the Jews have the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, this terrible last-minute attempt to fight back, which was and is still remembered for the Jews. And then the Poles had a Warsaw Uprising in 1944. I can't get into the detail of how they blame the Russians for helping them be defeated, but in many ways, the Warsaw Uprising of 44 is year zero of Polish history. They talk before and after the Warsaw Uprising. And at that point, you know, the city was heavily destroyed. Maybe 100,000 people were killed, lots of people evicted from the city. Here's that map again, pre-World War I, and I tried to get a similar map for now. I had a lot of trouble, couldn't find anything that I was satisfied with, but here is a map, Languages in Europe 2012. So for example, where my cursor is, they show Polish. Well, it's just not a block like that. It just can't be true. That's Poland. But at any rate, this is just a reminder that here's Poland, here's Ukraine, here's Belarus, here are the Baltic countries, and each of them have a national language. But it's confusing. For example, in Estonia, on the first map, they're up here, the Estonians, half the population is Russian speaking. So what do you do? I mean, it's a serious issue for these countries. Okay, now survivors after the war. Jewish survivors were few. There were few in Poland. There were some in Ukraine, and there were quite a few in the Soviet Union. I mean, the Jews who survived the war suffered, but they did survive somehow. And I wanted to mention here reactions. There's a story by a Yiddish writer named Chaim Grade, which is made into a movie called The Quarrel. And it talks about how do you deal with it, the events of the war. And this is a trailer for a movie, and this is about a minute. There is a movie, and it's this fellow rejects God. This fellow is reaffirmed in his faith. They meet, they were students together in the 1930s, and then in the story, they meet in Montreal after the war. So.
There were no sins, Hersh, that could ever justify God sending Hitler.
God abandoned us. No, he humiliated us. It was humiliation. 6 million of his chosen people. 1 million children. The children did not abandon God, Hersh. How can we ever forgive him for not saving the children?
If I knew God, I'd be God.
If I knew God, I would put him on trial.
It was after the war. Two friends met again. Each had lost his family, but had found a reason to go on.
My destiny was to be a Yiddish writer, so I write.
One through his faith in God, the other through his faith in man.
That human beings must help each other.
If a person does not have the Almighty to turn to, if there is nothing in the universe that's higher than human beings, then what's morality? Morality is a matter of opinion.
When they were younger, they were locked in a passionate quarrel. Today, they will continue.
You know, sometimes I thought that melody would coax the Messiah down to earth.
Well, it didn't.
Saul Rubinek, R.H. Thompson.
It's a very interesting movie. I wasn't able to find how you get a hold of it, although if you look on YouTube, there are 10-minute excerpts from it. And I just recommend it. Fits in with this notion of memory, what happened, and how do you proceed now on the basis of that memory.
The war deprived them of.
After the war, you have Ukrainians leaving Poland. And here is, you see this big blue line? That's Poland between the two wars. After the war, pink is Poland. So I tried to help you a bit here with formerly Poland is this stuff. Formerly German is this pink stuff here. So the Poles from here, the Eastern Poles, are put over here. So the Polish Easterners become the Polish Westerners. And remember, we have Galicia down here. Galicia is in Ukraine now, and it's a hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism. So we have these population exchanges. Well, the Poles leave the Ukraine. We used to call it the Ukraine. Now we're told to call it Ukraine. And you get an ethnic cleansing of southeastern Poland, where the Ukrainians are kicked out. Here's just a book of showing some of the characters that are known from history. From 1939 to 41, the Soviets deported 400,000 Polish citizens from the areas that they took over, according to that Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And then there's this infamous scene of Katyn, where for a couple of years, no one could find what happened to these 10,000 or more Polish officers. They didn't know where they were. No one was talking. And all of a sudden, the Nazis discovered a mass grave. And they really played this up because what had happened is that the Soviets had killed all of those people. shot them in an attempt to exert their control over the new territories that they took over. When the German invasion came, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, executed thousands of political prisoners who are mainly Ukrainian. I mean, human life no longer has a value in the eyes of these people. The Nazis exterminated 200,000 Jews in Volhynia, which was part of Poland, now Ukraine. And unfortunately, we know that about 12,000 Ukrainian policemen assisted 1,400 German policemen in their jobs. It's an ugly truth. But then in 1943, these Ukrainians who had been trained in murder didn't have any Jews left to kill. They deserted to the Ukrainian Independence Army. They knew the methods. They were trained in Nazi methods. And they killed Ukrainian opponents as well as Poles. I mean, these guys are vicious. I mean, once human life is degraded, you're willing to kill people everywhere. And in 1943-44, there's a Polish-Ukrainian civil war, and people go in and wipe out whole villages. If it's Polish, Ukrainians are known to have wiped them out. If it's Ukrainian, the Poles have been known to kill everybody in town. It's horrible. Then, and what's happening, each group is attempting to cleanse, quote, its area of the other nationality. It's not genocide, if you will, in the sense that they're not trying to kill everybody if they don't have to. They want them to leave. They don't hesitate to kill them, but what they want to do is get them to go, particularly, Galicia, certainly in what was then Eastern Galicia, now Western Galicia after the war. Chava just pointed out, there is still a part of Poland called Galicia. But one often makes this distinction between ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's of no consolation to people who are at risk. So as I say, starting in 1943, the Jews were gone. It's the Poles versus the Ukrainians. Here's a quotation from the High Command of the Ukrainian Independence Army. "Once more, I remind you, first call upon Poles to abandon their land and only later liquidate them, not the other way around." It's awful. The Polish army, government in exile, not the government in exile, but the Polish army supported by the Soviets, started what they called Operation Tempest in 1944. And they allied with the Red Army to drive out the Wehrmacht, the German army. And their aim is to show that Poles are legally in charge in Volhynia and Galicia. Here is the Polish name, Wołyń. This is Volhynia. This now is in Ukraine. Here is what's now in Ukraine, what's now called, it's now Western Galicia. And over here, where you see Tarnów, Nowosolsk, that's the parts of Galicia still in Poland. And here's an example, Polish army, home army unit with a Soviet patrol. And interesting, when it says home army, that's a group that's anti-Soviet. So both groups are cooperating with the Soviets in an attempt to drive out the Germans. And how did the Soviets end the Civil War? Well, they participated in the ethnic cleansing and in the mass murders. And they expelled 6 million Germans from the old Eastern territories of Germany. oops, there's the other line, from the new Polish territory. What is called Silesia, what was called Pomerania and Brandenburg. These are all old German territories. And the Germans were kicked out, and it's, so Germans in the post-war period will often talk about how much they suffered. You sort of play down what happened under the Nazis, and you have this suffering of these people living in barns and sheds and fields for up to 5 years and more after the war. Well, in this survey of what was going on after the war, I'm going to look at Poland again. I've mentioned Adam Mickiewicz a number of times as the Polish national poet. He has a play, a poem called Forefathers' Eve, which I have to admit, I've tried a number of times to read. It's tough going. The Polish, for me, is complicated, and it's tied up with Polish history. But you can play up an anti-Russian part. And in 1968, there was a production in Warsaw, new production, that gave rise to anti-Russian demonstrations in the audience. The Russians were very upset about this, and the Polish Communist Party is sort of upset about it because it's a questioning of their rule. Now, at the same time, you get a conflict within the Polish Communist Party between what are called the nationalist communists and the regular Communist Party, but it's really a power struggle. And the horrible irony of it is that what they do, they resorted to an interwar Polish thing. They blame the Jews. I mean, it's just difficult to fathom. It is true that Jews were active in the Communist Party, that those a few thousand who came back from the Soviet Union, or those who had been in hiding, saw the Communist Party as a road to social climbing. And it's also true that there were a number of Jews in the secret police and were hanging judges. But I remember one time when I was in Poland, this 2012, 2013, I was having a discussion with our guide, who was very friendly to Jewish visitors. And he said, 30% of the secret police were Jews. Now, I don't know about the numbers, and it may have been true initially. Of course, what he didn't say was, 70% of the secret police were Poles. What happens is the Poles become identified as individuals. So the Jews after 68 are kicked out again. There were a number of teachers, lawyers, members of the party. Not only Jews were kicked out, but they were the particular target. They have these speeches. If you want, those who want to leave can leave. And of course, Israel is seen as the aggressor after the 67 war. That was the Soviet line. So that's what you have at that time. There was this, Chava mentions in the chat what I just said. Don't forget about the impact of the 67 war of Israel in the Middle East. But that wasn't the source of the aggravation in Poland. Here's a Polish police chasing demonstrators in 1968. And this is a photo that I took on May Day. Just down with Zionism. What Zionism has to do with May Day, what it had to do with things in Poland, nothing, but that becomes the symbol of how to focus people's attention on something else. Here's 1968. This is anti-students. It says right here, students go back to class. because they were in the anti-Russian demonstrations. And at the same time, we demand the unmasking and punishment of Zionist troublemakers. And here you have, in the 21st century, President Duda of Poland makes an apology for 1968, this forced emigration of 20,000 Jews. I mean, a large proportion of the remainder of the Jews living in Poland. I mean, there was this recognition that something bad happened. Here is President Duda, that's a Polish flag, President Duda. On the other hand, you still have these large pockets of anti-Semitism. Right-wing social media in 2018, this is more a rural phenomenon, a small town phenomenon, but it's there. The Jews in Israel have the liberal lobby in Brussels on a leash. Too bad that not all Jews emigrated in 1968. Now they're showing off again. These attitudes die hard. Remember, I talked about Agnon's novel Guest for the Night as a symbol of, they're saying, well, the Jews were just a guest for the night, time to get rid of them. Of course, they were there for 700 years. But this is this so-called integral nationalism. There is some change among Poles, especially among the intellectuals in the urban areas. There's an infamous pogrom in Kielce in 1946 after the war. And this is a picture when I visited Kielce in 2012 or 2013. Here's a memorial. It's a very striking memorial to the victims at the time. And here's a memorial service, so it's 2012. Here's a memorial in Krakow today in the square where Jews were gathered before they were evacuated to camps. Well, the evolving Polish attitudes. If you may or may not know that for the first few years after the war, there was a kind of a coalition government, but then the communists took over completely in 1948. And as I said, there were a number of Jews in the secret police and in the upper ranks of the party. It gave rise to this term, Żydokomuna. Well, that's an older term. It means Jew commie regime. And it's an ugly term, and it still surfaces at times. Here is a more recent, commie Żydokomuna, commie Jew regime, death, destruction, and masturbation. In 1968, we had this expulsion. And then in Poland, we're moving away from the Jewish attitude here. Solidarity emerges in 1980. And in fact, I heard a Jewish activist in Poland give a talk saying that the irony of the expulsions of 68 were that they couldn't use anti-Semitism in 1980. He thinks it would have happened either by solidarity or by the government. But anyway, martial law was instituted in 1981. It was a very difficult time across Poland. And as you know, eventually the government fell after Gorbachev was in the Soviet Union. And you have these famous roundtable discussions in 1989, which lead to an independent Poland. And the great hero at the time was Lech Wałęsa. Here he is speaking at a meeting of Solidarity. Like a lot of us, he doesn't have so much hair anymore. The Polish word is Solidarność. And here, this was this symbol that they used. And after 89, there's a new attitude toward minorities. A recognition that minorities did have a role to play in Polish history, not just the Jews. Jews were significant, but also the Germans, for example. When I was in Poland in the 1960s, It was no longer illegal to speak German in the streets, but you still could get in trouble for it. Now there's a recognition that there was a German settlement there. However, the Poles still remember Katyn. Remember, this is what I mentioned a few minutes ago, the assassination of the Polish officer corps. A memorial was set up in 2008, and in 2010, a plane carrying leaders of the Polish government was on the way to Katyn, and it crashed, killed the president of Poland. It killed lots of members of parliament. Of course, there's still the talk. People say, oh, it was a Russian plot to kill everybody. There's no evidence of that. Who knows why? I mean, there's some evidence of bad weather and impatience to get to the memorial. Whatever, it was a real tragedy that people haven't gotten over. This is the Katyn Memorial of the, giving the names of some of the 10,000 people who were killed there. And this is President Putin even at Katyn. There is, at least on the surface, is an attempt at reconciliation and a recognition of bad things in the past. In 2018, the right wing took over the Polish government, the right wing party. And, it's not a coup, but a democratic election. Since that election, that party has been trying to solidify its power by, for example, by changing the makeup of the Supreme Court, by taking over the news organizations in Poland. Or recently, there's this law that says, if you mentioned that Poland participated in the Holocaust, that's a crime. And it's a real attempt to solidify their control. And you're going to understand that Donald Trump was very popular in Poland, especially with this party in power. And there's still things going on. We don't know what's going to happen in Poland. But a lot of this argument is over memory. There's now an accusation that Lech Wałęsa had been an informer for the secret police in the 1970s, which of course he denies. It isn't clear what happened. But, we keep going back. I'm going to move over to Ukraine because, we're talking about Ukrainians and Poles here. Long live the blooming Soviet Ukraine, the unbreakable vanguard of the great Soviet Union. This is a typical poster of during the time that the Soviet Union existed. Here, is this in Ukrainian, not in Russian down here? And here is Lenin. I don't know who that is, whether that's Stalin as a young man, I'm not sure. But after 1989, you have Ukrainian independence, and in the 1990s, a movement called Ruch. The word means movement, but that's their movement became known. And you have the toppling of statues. Ruch in the 1990s had a reputation of being extremely corrupt. And there was even a case where a journalist accused the president of Ukraine of ordering murders of opponents of the regime. And you get, in 2005, demonstrations on the Maidan, the big square in Kiev, that kicked out a lot of the old communists who had been running the government for 15 years. And you get another group, and of course they're not so successful. And then in 2014, Euromaidan, it happened again, what was called the Orange Revolution. So there are strong movements for independence,
All right. Have a good night.
Somebody is unmuted. Please mute yourself. There are movements for independence, but remember, independence doesn't necessarily mean democracy, as we saw with the plot against the opponents of the regime. And Putin, for example, the irony, Putin comes out and says, attacks the Ukrainian nationalists for being anti-Semites. And very ironic that the leader of Russia is chastising someone for being anti-Semitic. But it is true that among the rabid Ukrainian nationalists, there is a strong right-wing group that has a strong anti-Semitic feeling. Once again, a country without very many Jews, and yet it's there. And we've mentioned Galicia a number of times. That's where they're concentrated. The most rabid nationalists come from the old, what's now Western Ukraine. For those who follow what's going on, in 2014, the Russians re-annexed Crimea. Crimea, is this peninsula in the southern part of Ukraine that in 1956 was administratively shifted from the Russian Federation to Ukraine. And when Ukraine declared independence, they assumed they'd take Crimea with them. The problem for Russia, this is an important port for its navy. Russia does not have a lot of warm water ports, and they just took it over. They're a very powerful neighbor. And then there are breakaway areas. Again, if you may read in eastern Ukraine, we'll see a map in a minute, of people who say, we don't want to be in this Ukraine. We are Russians, and we want to be part of Russia. Now, in many countries, you have these minority nationalist movements, but ordinarily they do not get armed support, such as Russia. We know that Russia has been sending soldiers in there to maintain this. If you compare this to, to Catalonia, to Scotland, to Belgium, I mean, all these separatist movements, but they're not being supported by armies from another country. Ukraine also has its historical memory, and this is something that Chava pointed out to me the other day. This is right now the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium in the University of Alberta. That is, just as the Jewish groups have all these Holocaust study groups and institutes, the Ukrainians have their strong historical memory. This Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, that they have not forgotten, that this is a major issue in their history and in their identity. Let's look at national anthem of Ukraine, because the words are interesting. Ще вмерла Україна і слава і воля, ще нам, браття молоді, усміхнеться доля, жінуть наші вороженьки, як роса на сонці, запануємо, браття, у своїй сторонці. Душу тіло ми положимо за нашу свободу і покажемо, що ми, браття, козацького роду. Ukraine has not perished, nor her glory and freedom. Still upon us, young brethren, fate shall smile. Our enemies shall vanish like dew in the sun. We too shall rule in our beloved country. Soul and body shall we lay down for our freedom and show that we are brethren of the Cossack nation. It's interesting that, they trace themselves back to the Cossacks. At the very first class, we talked about Bogdan Khmelnytsky and this Cossack revolt. And then in the 17th and 18th century, a number of Cossack revolts against whoever the governments were. And here we have, this I think is Euromaidan 2014. And it's interesting here, this obviously 2014, because in addition to Ukrainian flags, you see the flag of the European Union. I mean, that was the big demonstration in 2014, and brought a lot of Russian pressure when Ukraine was talking about joining the European Union. I want to compare that. Look at the Polish national anthem. Starts off, Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Poland has not perished so long as we are alive. You know, Jane and I sang that a few classes ago. But here you have Poland has not perished. Ukraine has not perished. Israeli national anthem. As long as a Jewish soul is alive, our hope is not lost for 2,000 years. Look at the emphasis on the history, how important it is to remember whether they're past glories or not glories, but they're saying this is not something brand new. This is something that is important for our current national consciousness. All right, now, who's a Ukrainian? Let me tell you, this is not an easy issue. I'll try to explain this map to you. This is the Ukraine, and it's looking at the distribution of languages in the country. So here, if we look over here, this is Galicia over here. For instance, it says Ukrainian 95.3%, Russian 3.8%, or 97.3%. As you move toward the center of the country, you get more Russian speakers. Remember, they all went to school in Russian. They all know Russian. But what is their native language? And then when we get to the east, we see Ukrainian 53%, Russian 44%. Here, Russian 63%, and Ukrainian 30%. These two areas here are the breakaway areas that the Russians have supported, and the people are claiming in this so-called Donetsk Republic that they don't want to be part of Ukraine. You have this area in green, this area in green. It's almost 50-50. So there's still issues for them. Here's Crimea. I said that I wanted to show you this is this peninsula. 77% of the people speak Russian, according to this 2001 census. And just to fill this out, to make it even more confusing, this says Ukrainian 46.3%, Russia 41.9%, White Russian 4.8%, and Moldavian or Romanian 3.7%. Political lines do not determine everything. It's just a very unclear situation. And this should give you, this is what the Russians use as justification for what they're doing. I'm not justifying, I'm just telling you where the problems lie. I remember having one of my old singing teachers a few years ago came from Odessa, which is down here. And I asked her if she's Russian or Ukrainian. She said she didn't know. But after 2014, the Euromaidan, she decided that she is definitely Ukrainian. So it's an issue here. I also wanted to mention something about Jews in the Soviet Union because they're a nationality that's still there. In 1917 to 18, there was a short-lived alliance between Jews and Ukrainians. Here's a banknote in Ukrainian, Polish, and Yiddish. For a short time they had that. But then that didn't last long, and you have pogroms by the white armies, that is the Russian counter-revolutionaries, and the Ukrainian armies. The Soviet regime set up something called the Yevsektia, which the mission of Yevsektia, which was staffed often by Jews, was a destruction of traditional Jewish life, destruction of the Zionist movement, and the destruction of Hebrew culture, in an attempt to have a different Jewish life separate from any allegiances to the West or to any other country. So in the 1920s, there's a good deal of Yiddish publishing. It's often enough government-oriented publication, but it's there. And they go so far as, they try to change the orthography to, quote, modernize the Hebrew alphabet. It never caught on. And, when you try to read it today, it's jarring. It's hard to read the stuff that they published. As opposed to in 1917, they also modernized the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, which has caught on, although there were many emigres who didn't like it. Another thing that occurred was a place called Birobidzhan. It looks like I left out some letters, but Birobidzhan was set up in the Soviet Far East, way, way east, almost on the border of Korea, which was supposed to be a Jewish settlement. It wasn't very big. It was symbolic of the recognition of the unusual place of Jews in the Soviet Union that is considered a nationality, but it had no territory. And the first settlers went out there in 1934, totally unprepared. It was a terrible preparation, and it never really succeeded, although it still exists. And you have a few streets with Yiddish names, but, there's the map. Here's the Soviet Union, way down there in the corner. This is the Korean Peninsula right here, and here's Birobidzhan. This is far, really far. If I'm not mistaken, it's further from here to Moscow than it is from Moscow to New York. So gives you an idea of the geographic extent of the Soviet Union. But here is the kind of propaganda. You have a square in the Birobidzhan with this candelabra menorah. Here is a pamphlet, "Hurrah for the country, where national oppression is no longer possible." And there is a recent book, "Where the Jews Aren't," as the subtitle, "The Sad and Absurd Story of Birobidzhan, Russia's Jewish Autonomous Region," written by a lady named Masha Gessen. Masha Gessen is a journalist who's done a lot of interesting work, and she lives both in the United States and in Russia. So if you're interested, she's certainly an author, a reporter worth looking at. We talked about the Great Purge of the 1930s. Now, the question is, were they anti-Semitic? There were plenty of people who argue that. On the other hand, that purge attacked all kinds of nationalities. There was a Russification program. A lot of Jews were hurt because they had been active in the party. But in the 1930s, there were also attacks on Germans, Poles, and Koreans, all of whom were seen as threats to the Soviet Union. So at least stuff that I've been able to make out is that the 1930s did not witness any significant anti-Semitic policy of the government. It changes shortly after that, but that's wasn't the case in the 30s. In 1942, they set up something called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. There were these other anti-fascist committees for other nationalities, but this is the most successful one. And the most well-known figure in it was an actor named Solomon Michaels. This committee was set up to generate support abroad. And here you have Michaels in the United States on a big trip. They came in a rally. Albert Einstein they met. Itzik Pfeffer a Yiddish writer who was later executed. Michols was also executed even earlier than Pfeffer. But at the same time as you get that anti-fascist committee, you begin to get a nationalist emphasis by the Russians. You know, for example, in the news, they said too many Jewish reporters on the newspapers. There was this thing called the Tashkent Front, that is to say, way out in Central Asia, the Jews went to Tashkent and supposedly they were fighting. This is the accusation that the Jews were cowards. Ilya Ehrenburg and Vasily Grossman, I've mentioned Grossman before, were reporters who put together a book, The Black Book, The Holocaust in Russia. It was written and then banned in Russia. It was not published in Russia until the 1980s. It was translated to English and published in the late 40s. Here's the complete Black Book of Russian Jewry. And I just wanted to mention Grossman again. He's considered one of the most important novelists of Russia, at least in the second half of the 20th century. And he's got Life and Fate. I keep recommending to you these huge books that could be used as doorstops. This one is quite a book. Central part is the Seeds of Stalingrad, but there's a lot of other stuff that goes on in there. Life and Fate is the title. Well, in the late 40s, the Zhdanovshchina, Zhdanov was the head of the secret police. When you have a word ending shchina, it generally refers to some negative campaign, and you get an arrest and trial of Jewish writers and activists, and there's this infamous execution of them in August 1952, something that is still part of Jewish memory. Doesn't take the place of the Holocaust, but it's still important in the memory. Remember, I said at the beginning, we're talking a lot about Jewish memory and other memory. In 52, the doctor's plot. The Soviets claim that the Jewish doctors were ready to poison Stalin and members of the Politburo. Oops, I don't want that yet. The doctor's plot, also, there was some thought that there may have been a plan to expel the Jews from the Soviet Union to Asia. We don't know, but that's one explanation of what was coming. Fortunately for the Jews, Stalin died in early 53, and they immediately called off the plot. And then in 1956, you have Khrushchev made a secret speech, as some call it, the speech that shook the world, in which he denounced the crimes of the Stalinist regime. To me, it's ironic that that speech got to the West from an Israeli reporter who got it from a Polish activist. The thaw in the Soviet Union was, that is, the cutting away of the Stalinist regime. Supposedly, anti-Semitism wasn't there, but it was there. They supported the anti-Jewish campaign in Poland in 1968, the Żydo Komuna, which I mentioned. Here's some more pictures from Poland. (1968) May Day, the Party Forever purged the Zionists from the party. The Refusnik movement, Refusniks who refused to cooperate with the Soviet regime. And we had the United States, this Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which affected trade relations with countries with non-market economies, that restricted freedom of immigration. That was a sticky point between the US and the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. And you have this program of trying to get people out of the Soviet Union, the politics of Soviet Jewish emigration. This is just a passport of someone who was allowed to go, gives her name, she's born in 54, and where's she going? going to Israel. I mean, you had to say you were going to Israel. A lot of people got to Vienna and didn't go there, but that was the only place you were allowed to apply for. After 1991, there's a massive emigration of Jews from Russia and Ukraine. Now there are about 1 million Soviet Jews in Israel, all voting for right-wing parties. I mentioned this Putin condemnation of Ukrainian nationalist demonstrators as anti-Semites, the irony of that coming from a Russian. Well, what's going on now? You have the right-wing triumphant in Poland, restriction of liberties, changing the judicial system. Here's a Polish protest. Well, one of the things that the government is trying to do is toughen the abortion laws. And here, I wish I could abort my government. Obviously, someone with a sign in English is trying to convince the Western press. And, it's not something that ordinarily you would find in Poland for Polish protesters. There's a minor Jewish revival in Poland, but it's minor, even though there's some persistent anti-Semitism. We've seen some of that. And here's one. This is Poland, not Polin, which is a Hebrew for Poland. And this is a right-wing mass demonstration against US pressure to compensate Jewish victims from Poland during the Holocaust. So it's a mixture of anti-Jewish feeling, anti-American feeling, anti-European Union, pro-communist. In Poland, what's interesting is now you have a large number of Ukrainian laborers. They're coming in to do the work that the Poles don't want to do. It's reminiscent of what we have in the United States. We're using immigrants for work that we don't want to do. At the same time is that there's supposedly large numbers of Polish workers in Western Europe. They say there are 900,000 Poles in England. I'm not sure what's going to be now with Brexit, but there was all this campaign in the Great Britain against the Polish plumber who was taking our jobs. I read an article the other day. It said, as now with COVID-19 and the shutdown, some people are leaving Western Europe, possible brain gain, that is to say, reversing the brain drain and people coming home. We don't know. It's happening right now. In Ukraine, there's a strong feeling of nationalism. There's anti-Polish feeling. There's anti-Semitic feeling. There's ongoing corruption. And finally, Jewish emigration from Eastern Europe. We have 1 million emigres from the old Soviet Union to Israel. In the United States in 2011, we think there are about 900,000 Russian speakers. They're not all Jewish emigres, but a lot of them are. I just want to end a little bit with this. Paul Ricoeur, French philosopher. You could say that certain people suffer from too much memory, as if they were haunted by the memory of humiliations that they suffered in the past, as well as by the memory of long past glories. But couldn't one also say to the contrary, that other people suffer from a lack of memory, as if they were fleeing from the ghost of their own past? Here's this Polish Institute of National Remembrance. Here was an article, it's on YouTube, Ukraine and Poland trying to come together. Here's the Ukrainian president at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. I would like to close this with my own memory here. I mentioned once before this song, Zogvit Kenmo, which is the theme song of the Jewish partisans of World War II. And it's been translated to many languages, and Jane and I are going to sing it now as an ending to today. In order, there's Yiddish, Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, and English. So here we go. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, wenn Himmeln bleiene verstellen bleue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser heißgebänkte Schau, es wird abheugt und unser Trott will seinen da. Anatomar in Edarkia Achrona, et or hayom histiru shvei ha'anana, זה יום ניספנו לו עוד יעל ויבוא, ומצדנו עוד ירים אנחנו פה. Move nigdy, to ostatni krok. Dni podobny kryje w sobie ciemny mrok. Jeszcze przyjdzie część stęskniony naszych snów i za trudny krok nasz my jesteśmy znów. Never say that there is only death for you. The leaden skies may be concealing days of blue, because the hour that we have hungered for is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble, we are here. Because the hour that we have hungered for is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble, we are here. I'm open to some comments. You can unmute yourself. Chava made a number of comments that I tried to answer some of during the thing about she's also very interested in Jews in Poland and spent time there. But go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to comment or say something.
Let me just say one thing, and this is when Poland began to open up, and post 68 and post 80 with Solidarność, Jewish historians first started going into Poland, could now go into Poland. And in those very early days, the historian of Poles and Judaism, Jews in Poland, Gershon Hundert, came back from one of these very early forays, and he told the following story, which I think people will find interesting. One of the people he met was a man named Kosta Gebert, who was a journalist who participated in the Jewish revival that began at that time in Poland. And Kosta said that he, in the early days of all this, he went to address a class of medical students, that is, intellectuals in Poland, smart people, and he said to them, he wanted to talk to them about Jews so they would understand more about them. And he started out by saying, "What do you know about Jews?" So one medical student raised his hand and he said, "I know that they kill Christian babies and use their blood for matzahs," the old blood libel. And Costa said to them, "How many of you believe it?" Everybody in the class raised their hand.
Oh, God.
As Gershon explained it to us, he said, in Poland, communist Poland, you don't trust the government, and you do trust your grandmother. So the government says that the government, however anti-Semitic it may have been, denied the blood libel, which is a libel, not history. And your grandmother know from her, family lore that that's what Jews did. So you believe your grandmother, you don't believe the government. And Costa argued with them or tried to explain for an hour. And at the end of time, he convinced the majority of the class, he thinks, that Jews do not kill babies and use their blood for matzahs. So this was, I guess, around 1980 or something like that.
Yeah. Neville, did you want to ask a question and make a comment? You have to unmute yourself.
Very similar to Chava's story. I was at a meeting in Poland run by a very close friend of mine. And we were in Silesia, in Wrocław, which used to be Breslau, where all the Germans had been uprooted and taken back to Germany, and the Poles from the east had come over and resettled everything. But what was interesting about that area is that there were no forests left. Everything had been cut down during the war and after the war, and probably as the Germans were resettled, they took a lot of timber with them. But the biggest fight I had with my close friend was about whether there was anti-Semitism in Poland, and he insisted absolutely that there was none. And what Chava says is that there absolutely was, and still is. Anyway, that's my story.
Yeah, I would say that my impression of Poland is among the intellectuals and among the urban classes, some of them have come to terms with Polish history. And this ruling party, ironically, has not resorted to anti-Semitism, even though that is part of the ideology of the grandmothers who vote for them. I don't know how this plays out in Ukraine and why there's even anti-Semitism still around Ukraine, but it's there. But there are other items in their historical memory. As I say, this right-wing government in Poland has been picking fights with Germany, with Russia, and with anyone who says anything derogatory about Poland. So they're lashing out in all directions. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you for attending. It's been exciting for me to work on this, and I welcome you for other classes of Village College, and I'll be seeing you all soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.